we're just going to show a short little video about Mind Medicine Australia and why we're doing what we're doing. Ilan, over to you.
Did you know that over 45% of Australians will experience mental illness in their lifetime? That's nearly half of us.
I can't sleep. Everything feels flat and grey. I feel ashamed.
Mental ill health devastates lives and families and costs Australians around $60 billion a year. Research and treatment expenses continue to rise, yet rates of mental illness indicate that we're losing the battle. New approaches are urgently needed to address this immense suffering and cost. Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is currently being trialled worldwide and has demonstrated remarkable promise in treating depression, anxiety, addiction, and post-traumatic stress disorder, with new trials underway for treatment of dementia and anorexia. The treatment combines a short program of psychotherapy with just a few medicinal doses of psilocybin or MDMA. In the 1950s and 60s, psychedelic treatments had a major impact in psychiatry, and many considered it the next big thing in mental health treatment. But for political reasons, the Nixon administration criminalised the use of psychedelics and effectively stopped all research. That research has finally begun again. With proper clinical support, psychedelic treatments are safe and frequently lead to remission after only a short program, and even where current treatments have failed. Here at Mind Medicine Australia, we believe everyone should have access to the best treatments for mental illness. Subject to forthcoming clinical trial results, we will seek to establish best practice in regulated psychedelic-assisted treatment. Mind Medicine Australia is wholly focused on the clinical application of psychedelic medicines. We're preparing for change by developing therapist training, ethical guidelines, a centre of excellence in psychedelic medicine, educational material and events, and supporting clinical research. We're a small organisation doing big things, and we need your support. Please share this video and visit our website to support us and get involved.
Thank you, Ilan, and we'll pop the presentation on the screen now, so we can just do our quick introductory slides, and then I'll have the great honour of introducing Greg. So just reminding everyone that we don't encourage or facilitate illegal use of psychedelics or plant medicines, and this disclaimer, which we have in all of our webinars and events. Next slide. So at the moment, and even before the COVID crisis, we have had this increasing mental illness epidemic, with 1 in 5 Australian adults having a chronic mental illness. Before the crisis, 1 in 8 Australians on antidepressants, including 1 in 4 older Australians with young children as young as 5 being prescribed antidepressants, and an estimated 1 in 2 of us will experience mental illness in our lifetimes. People are saying now that these figures are likely to escalate by at least 30% due to the collective crisis that we're experiencing, the collective trauma that we're experiencing through this COVID crisis, and that the suicide rate is likely to increase by up to 50%. Those are Australian statistics from organisations like Beyond Blue and Lifeline. Next slide, please. So our goal, we're a DGR1 charity, is to seek to broaden the treatment paradigm available to medical practitioners and their patients and improve treatment effectiveness. Our focus has been on psilocybin and MDMA, but we're also interested in other medicines and interested in investigating them for a range of conditions. Our goal is that these therapies become an integral part of the mental health system and that they become accessible and affordable to all Australians in need. The high remission rates are particularly important. Next slide, thank you. So unfortunately, we're in a situation where there's been no improvement in treatment outcomes for 50 years. So since these medicines were prohibited in 1970, the only really first-line treatments are either antidepressants or psychotherapy. And as you can see, only 35% of sufferers experience actual remission from either pharmacotherapy or psychotherapy. Some experience a response, but then often relapse, and the side effects are pretty nasty. And post-traumatic stress disorder is even harder to treat. So a more of the same approach is not going to solve this problem, and we need to provide treatments that practitioners and their patients are actually going to, experience remission and get better from, so that they can lead meaningful lives. Next slide. So at the moment, psilocybin is in final stages of breakthrough therapy designation with the FDA's is medicinal MDMA. Psilocybin for depression and potentially OCD and addiction, and MDMA for PTSD and treatment of addiction. And the remarkable thing about these medicines is they only require 2 to 3 dose sessions, in contrast to conventional treatments. And they're both considered extremely safe in medically controlled environments and non-addictive, which is why they're being used to treat addictions. Breakthrough therapy designations only provided to medicines that are considered vastly superior to existing medicines. The next slide. So our strategy is focused on 4 key areas: awareness and knowledge building, so education and events like this one tonight in our webinar series. We also do webinars in collaboration with other organisations. So for some of you on this webinar, you may be part of an organisation that is interested in learning more about these medicines and would like some of our psychiatrists or psychologists to come and speak about them. We also have a major international medical summit planned for November, and that's proving to be challenging due to the fact that we have 15 international speakers coming to Melbourne. Well, were coming to Melbourne, and now we're looking at potential contingencies for how we can make that summit work, or if we need to postpone it into 2021. But anyone, by the way, who's got tickets for that, we will be informing you probably at the end of August once we have more information from the government. In addition, we've started state and regional chapters. We have, I think, something like about 25 chapters in Australia and a few in New Zealand as well, and also interest from parts of Asia. And these chapters are designed to amplify the awareness and education building platform that we have, to help raise funds, to host screenings and other webinars and events, and to educate people about the science so we can get away from the stigma around these medicines. We're also interested in novel research. The second part of our pillar is a therapist professional development program. So we've just recently launched our certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapies, and have brought Renee Harvey over from Imperial College London, one of the leading clinical psychologists from the UK NHS. And she's designing and managing the certificate program, and we've already interviewed a number of psychiatrists, psychologists, drug and alcohol specialists, psychotherapists, mental health nurses, GPs and others who are interested in becoming psychedelic therapists and see that as a really important new string to their bows, and want to work with these medicines to heal their patients. We're also looking at setting up an Asia Pacific Centre for Emerging Mental Health Therapies in partnership with one or more universities in Australia for applied research and development, looking at the manufacture of the medicines and supply chains for the medicines, economic modelling, rollout of clinics, and we're also looking at the preferred legal and ethical frameworks for these medicines. So we just submitted rescheduling applications for psilocybin and MDMA to take them from Schedule 9 to Schedule 8. And in the second part of August, that submission will open for public consultation. And we would really welcome all of you on this call and all of the supporters we have to put in submissions to the TGA to support the rescheduling of these medicines, which is going to be fundamental so that they can become accessible sooner rather than later. We'll talk further about some of the other services later on, but suffice to say our focus is wholly clinical. We'll move now, I think, to introducing Greg. So we'll go to Greg's slides, I think, Ilan, and I'm just going to introduce you, Greg. So Dr. Gregg Henriques is Professor of Graduate Psychology at James Madison University in the Combined Integrated Doctoral Program in Clinical and School Psychology. He received his PhD in Clinical Psychology from the University of Vermont and did his postdoctoral training at the University of Pennsylvania. His primary area of scholarly interest is in developing a unified framework for both the science and practice of psychology. He authored the book, A New Unified Theory of Psychology, developed a popular blog on Psychology Today, Theory of Knowledge, where he's authored over 350 essays on psychology, philosophy, politics, and mental health. Fellow of the American Psychological Association, he's won numerous awards for teaching, scholarship, and service, and launched and leads the Theory of Knowledge Academic Society, which is quite fascinating. He has expertise in theoretical psychology, unified approaches to psychotherapy, psychological well-being, personality function, depression, and suicidal behaviour. And we're proud that he's a member of the Mind Medicine Australia Advisory Panel. So, thank you, Greg. We will spotlight you now and look forward to hearing from you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that introduction. I deeply appreciate what Mind Medicine is about. And I believe that there are lots of different areas that our mental health field needs to think seriously about and move towards transforming, both because of the mental crises that we face and because there's an enormous amount of wisdom available to us that I think sometimes our traditional mindsets blind us to. So I really appreciate your leadership and hope to see some of this happening in the United States as well. So thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with the participants here. Oh, I'm on the wrong side here. Okay. Okay. So there it is. It's great. So yeah, I'm going to be talking today about the psychology of psychedelics, a view from the unified framework. As Tania mentioned, my particular interest is thinking about kind of what is psychology, what is psychotherapy, and taking a very big and broad view and wondering whether or not we can achieve a more coherent and integrated view as opposed to the multiple different paradigms that are out there like psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral, humanistic, and so forth. So that's my primary interest. We can talk, I like the idea of psychedelics for a whole host of different reasons. One of the things that I like about it is that it opens up so much creativity potential, and I believe that that's one of the very good therapeutic elements. And I think it bridges science and the humanities in a particular kind of way. That's one of my interests. You see a tree behind me, sort of a cartoon representation, sort of an ironic, sincere representation of my theoretical framework. And I've been following Timothy Leary actually for a while, both in relationship to some of his work in psychedelics, but actually I was heavily influenced. A part of the unified theory stems from his work in personality and interpersonal relations called the circumplex model of dominance and nurturance. And so I have an appreciation at multiple levels in relationship to some of his work. So, but apart from sort of the potential creativity, exploration, possible play that psychedelics offer in relation, it's also the case, as Tania mentioned, that we are dealing with very serious business here. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work with depression, suicide, individuals dealing with that, personality problems, trauma, of course, PTSD. And what we are seeing is an enormous need for mental health treatments and innovations. And we can look to the wisdom traditions to see that, in fact, for as long as we've been humans, transformational conscious experiences has been part of cultures, of rites of passage of shamanistic explorations into meaning making. And so I think it would behoove us enormously to spend a lot of time with those wisdom traditions. And what I'm going to be arguing today is that actually we can say with scientific confidence of our using scientific epistemology, like how we know about reliability and validity, that there is something very serious here when we're talking about transformational experiences. And of course, transformational experiences play a huge role in cultures, but they also play a huge role in how people make meaning, how they see themselves in relationship to the world. And mental health very much connects to how people construe themselves in relationship to the world. I believe we're seeing a worldwide mental health crisis. I believe that there are a host of reasons for why we're experiencing crises of both meaning and mental health. And I believe that we need to initiate a wide variety of different potential changes as we explore ways to address this and grow in a different direction. And there are good reasons, I believe, to critique the current structure of both psychiatry, psychology, and mental health. And I hope to see some significant transformations. I'm happy to take any questions along those lines. And most important for those of us that are have a clinical science orientation, meaning that we really want to see evidence for any claims that are made in relation to advocating particular treatments, we are actually seeing now certainly a renaissance inside the clinical science research field that is demonstrating the potential or sort of remarkable outcomes that might be had through these avenues. And so there already is enough empirical evidence, as far as I'm concerned, to be highly optimistic and to seriously engage in laying the groundwork. So I embrace this. I think that the Mind Medicine Australia crew has developed an enormous amount around this. And my goal in this presentation is to offer you some frames of reference. Before I do that, let me set the stage here with just a little narrative, okay? My goal here is to give you just a quick frame of reference for what's going on, perhaps in some psychedelic transformational consciousness experiences. Then I'll explain to you why this is an important thing to seriously consider. And then ultimately, the goal of this presentation is to introduce to you ways of thinking about consciousness and cognition so that you can have a frame of reference to both understand what happens during transformational experiences, why they're very important, and then what would be the implications of that for setting up a therapeutics around it. So here's a quick narrative. I'm not going to list too many names, but I will say that this is in the context of a family experience. We were at a family gathering, and somebody that I know very intimately well never used any substances of any kind until he was like 45 or 50. And then he did and would find himself engaged in a wide variety of different wonderings. Okay. And we were at a family event and he was partaking in this. And we actually happened to be watching, we were on the East Coast. We were watching a football game back in the days when football games were on TV. And he noticed at the time, it was dark outside. He was watching a game on the West Coast that was light outside. And he was thinking about, well, what's happening now and what's happening there, which is now. And he asked the question, what is time? Okay. He kind of wondered about simultaneity, things happening exactly the same time, but then they happen at different times. How much of time is a human construction? What does now mean? Okay. And on the one hand, you could look at this, and indeed my father was in the room and knows this individual very well. And my father's reaction was not very pleasant. My father never partook in any kind of psychedelics and was fairly conservative around these. And he basically just dismissed this and said, stop, you're being silly, okay? And what I want to show here in this relation, what we're going to get to is that there is a fundamental relation between various parts of our mind, okay, there's a wondering phenomenological part of our mind, which I'll talk about, that seeks an intuitive relationship between oneself and the world. Okay? And there is a rational justifying part of the mind. And the relationship between these two is very, very important to understand. And this little vignette offers us a little peek into some of the dynamics between potentially these different minds, where one mind will potentially wonder about things that are, well, yeah, maybe silly, but also, let's face it, the question actually, what is time, is actually a very profound question. Okay, and it opened up in my close person. It opened up a way of thinking about the world and his relationship to the world in a way that was potentially very creative. It also created anxiety. It created anxiety in a structure system that needs to have cognitive certainty, and that's represented here in my father's concern. And I would argue that our society really, in fact, Ian McGilchrist is a well-known psychiatrist who wrote the book called The Master and His Emissary, which represents the two hemispheres and their relation. And he argues that we have essentially dominated our using our left hemisphere and rational side, dominated our right hemisphere exploratory side. And the relationship between these two elements need to be revisited. And ultimately, that theme is going to come back, and I begin with it to come back to it at the end and say, how do we hold these two themes, these two domains of mind in the relation? And actually, psychedelics will set the stage for potentially shaking these up when they get stuck in less than healthy relations. So we are stuck with a problem to be explained here. And I want to give some acknowledgement to this problem. Much of this talk is a combination of my work and a man by the name of John Vervaeke, but I want to be clear that there actually, when we get into transformational consciousness experiences, there really is a problem to be understood. If you take a survey, large-scale survey of individuals, you get about 30 to 40% who have had a clearly who will report a very meaningful, higher or transformational consciousness experience that played a significant role in their lives, okay? And these, one of the things that's really unique about these is, unlike the way my father said, oh, I'm gonna dismiss this individual's notion about what time is, because it's silly or because it's unreal, because everyone just knows, okay, there's a time differential between East and West, that's not explained. People fundamentally experience these as more real than the normal. So if you have dreams or you get really drunk and forget about the normal, just attribution is, well, I was disturbed, I was disoriented, I was in an altered state. So therefore it was, I can explain what happened as being less real. But that's not the case here. What people do is they experience these events not as less real from altered states, but actually seeing a deeper truth. And their lives reflect it. You can empirically demonstrate their lives change as a function of that. And these elements not only have several reliable features to them, they're set up by disruptive patterns, either sleep issues, restricting food, disrupting daily routines, meditation, or psychedelic substance use. They're articulated by a sense of ego dissolution. And really the father picture there is going to represent the ego that is telling in a narrative form, sort of forcing the world into particular boxes, to be concerned to protect the self, to create an ego justification narrative about how the world works. And then, but that dissipates. And what it dissipates into is an experience of oneness, a sense that one is transcendent, a transcendent ego experience, where the boundaries between oneself and one's concern and one's interest expand and then are woven together with the world in a new way. So these are reliable features of transformational experiences. And when individuals have positive experiences that are helpful in terms of their changing their mental health in a psychedelic use in a therapeutic setting, these patterns show up repeatedly. So why? John Vervaeke calls this the ontonormativity problem. Onto is short for ontological, meaning there's a real issue here. There's a normative feature to higher transformational states. And we need frames of reference, scientific frames of reference, if you're a scientist like I am, to actually account for these kinds of issues. So I'm going to share with you then, to do this, the notions of human consciousness and cognition from two different points of view. One is the book and my frame, a unified theory of psychology, a unified framework for approaching the field. And the second is John Vervaeke, who is an integrative cognitive scientist at the University of Toronto, and is now, I really strongly recommend his lecture series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. It's a 50-part lecture series. There was an interesting coincidence between me and John, and he was talking about these very things, and it happened to be talking about them, higher states of consciousness and transformations, in his 11th episode. I had written a blog called The 10 Problems of Consciousness. And although I referenced altered states in one of the problems, I did not talk about transformational states and the ontonormativity problem. So that set up an interesting juxtaposition that's allowed us to co-joint author a two-part blog series called The 11th Problem of Consciousness, such that, which is this ontonormativity problem, and what happens in higher transformational states, and what is our understanding of human consciousness that allows us to explain these events, at least provide a descriptive explanatory framework that is plausible. And that's what John and I are attempting to do. And I'll note that not too many frames of reference, integrative holistic frames out there that can provide practitioners with a clear rationale, understanding human consciousness and cognition, that allows practitioners to be able to explain to participants, A, what might be going on and why might this be really important. So John Vervaeke has 4 Ps, and this is a take-home point that I encourage you to walk around with to get used. These are the 4 Ps of cognition. Cognition meaning to know or to understand, and there are 4 different ways as humans we know and understand. So one is classically procedural. What is a procedural way? That basically is when you download something into your habit system, when there's a really set of constraints. A classic example would be learning to tie your shoe laces. A procedural knowing would be learning to drive a car or ride a bike. These are systems that we can have enough structure to them that you can essentially learn how to do without much consciousness awareness that your body can then perform. So procedural knowing is one kind. Perspectival knowing refers to knowing from your point of view. It refers to the way in which you integrate your senses, both the interior and exterior senses, to give rise to your phenomenological perspective on the world. Most classically for us as highly visual creatures, our visual knowing system. And then there's propositional knowing. Propositional knowing refers to how mostly how I'm exchanging information now. This is your justifying narrator and your meaning-making statements in language that allow you to understand, okay, these are the steps that you take in order to do something, or this is the first president of the United States. Propositional knowing is a lot of what we do in school. And then finally, there's what's called participatory knowing. Participatory knowing is best exemplified by things like jazz. Okay, you go into a jazz, I'm not a jazz musician, so I have to borrow from people tell me that this is what you do. You go into a scenario and you feel the room and you engage in flow, and it is a dance, it is a musical engagement. You don't know procedurally what's going on. You certainly can't describe it propositionally, but it is a transactional flow between you and the arena that you're in, often with other agents in a rhythm, as it were. Okay, so these 4 Ps of knowing organize the ways in which we perceive and learn to then control, and that's how you can basically give evidence for something that you know. So I want you to hold the 4 Ps. We're going to come back to them. When I saw John's 4 Ps, they connected very, very directly to my frame of reference. It does come at it from a slightly different angle, but these are complementary domains. So John's focusing on human cognition. And I'm going to share with you here what a part of the unified theory. It's called the updated tripartite model of human consciousness. Now, those of you that have a background in psychology may recognize the tripartite model. That comes from Sigmund Freud and his classic representation of the id, which is the seat of animalistic primal aggression, the ego, which is your self-conscious awareness, and the superego, which for Freud is the way you internalize social standards. And you're going to see some significant parallels in the updated tripartite model that I'm going to share, but it's one that's based on a lot more recent data, and then it organizes them in a particular way that's consistent with modern psychology and cognitive science. So here we have what's the depiction of the basic updated tripartite. This starts with an experiential self. Okay, experiential consciousness and experiential self. This refers very closely to what John would call your perspectival knowing. It's most obvious in terms of identifying the domains with how we perceive, that is how we integrate our senses together to create a holistic gestalt on the one hand. That's sort of the input function of the experiential consciousness, and then the feeling. The second is the private self. We'll talk about that in a bit. And the third is the public self. And these will overlap with the id, the ego, and the superego. So let me talk a little briefly about each one of these domains. So these domains are the experiential system, the private self-consciousness system, and the public self-consciousness system. Here's the experiential system, both put into a picture form. This is actually Ernst Mach, is a famous physicist, and was engaged in the discussion between what is the first-person perspective on the world, phenomenology, versus a more third-person physical objective perspective. So he sketched out his first-person perspective on the world. This is your perspectival knowing system. So you bring in your senses. They organize together in your perceptual field of consciousness. And you also then have emotional responses to these. The response set orients you toward making appraisals for what it is that's coming in. So if you see a bear, that has particular different kinds of meaning than if you see a sandwich. And you will have different kinds of feelings that are triggered in relationship to these perceptual gestalts. Your feeling system is your perceptual response system, meaning your emotional feeling system. That's why, for example, we talk a lot about depression. I often will say, well, what is depression? Sadness is the response to a loss of an object or an opportunity. And of course, many of us in the COVID world have been feeling losses in terms of conferences, in terms of graduations, in terms of sports, the disappointment of an investment, a path or object that is lost. That's the feeling of sadness. Depression is a mood that overtakes individuals and creates an overarching motivational emotional state of shutdown. And so depression is a state of behavioral shutdown. And I just share that because that emotional core is responding to the opportunities and investment patterns that you are perceiving. So the experiential, that's experiential consciousness, which is basically what's on the screen. The experiential self then connects you to what are called episodic memories. Episodic memories are things that you might recall of major events, and more recent things are easier to recall. So what did you do yesterday for dinner? That would be an episodic memory. But we store key episodic memories that are emotionally charged, and most relevant for therapists would be, for example, traumatic memories that influence aspects of our experiential self. Okay, and these get stored, then are related to by the way the system, the phenomenological system, integrates, organizes, or doesn't. And we'll talk about that when we move into the private self. Okay, so we can talk about perspectival knowing. You can open your eyes and you can see, hey, you can see redness. Okay, but that is quite different. Okay, then the second stream of reflective self-consciousness that says in narrative linguistic form, here I am, seeing red, it reminds me of apples. I like that shade. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're differentiating between two crucial streams of consciousness. One is your first-person phenomenological view, that is the experience of red, the pictorial sensory integration, and then there's the reflective narrator on that portion. That is called the private self-consciousness system. Okay, and that private self-consciousness system develops with the capacity of the language, starts really coming online when kids are about 18 months to 2 years old. That's when you start to gain real access to it. And what we're going to see is that this system then develops over time. Those of you that have children or work with adolescents, okay, why is adolescence such a turbulent period? Well, that's a period of significant development for this private self-consciousness system. It is when the identity of the individual solidifies, comes online, and starts to really generalize across situations. In other words, the adolescent carries around their self-concept, and they realize that they have to fit in as a self in relationship to all their friends. And the 8th grade turmoil is individuals trying to figure out who they are and what they share with others and who they want to be. Anybody that parents through that age knows that can be filled with a fair amount of strife and discomfort. But this system then really becomes the seat of your self-concept, your conscious identity, the desire of who you want to be. Now notice, who you want to be may be quite different than who your experiential self identifies as. Okay, and this becomes particularly the case when we realize that there is a difference between the private self, your internal narrative, and the public self. So here we have an individual with an interesting sweater on, okay, and you might have the private thought, hey, I don't like that. That doesn't look good on her. Now, if that becomes public, that has a different set of implications than if it's private. So guess what we often feel the need to do? We often feel the need to filter our private thoughts into something that looks quite different in the public. Okay, and every one of us likely has had the experience with quite a degree of regularity that we find ourselves having feelings and thoughts that if were shared or broadcast in a particular way, it would have significant influence on the social situation that would not necessarily be in our interests or in the interests of the people around us. So what do? We change what we publicly impression manage. There's a famous sociologist actually called microsociology called Irving Goffman back in 1957 wrote a hugely influential book called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. Okay, and actually I think he's taken off Freud there in terms of the psychopathology of everyday life. But what he's talking about is the presentation of how do we show what we are to others, and how do we take into consideration the public influence, and by public I don't mean broadly, I just mean like, will this other person know, and what do we hide from other individuals? And what this shows then is that there are these easily recognizable domains. And what the unified theory says is, okay, we can identify these domains, and then we can also start to really talk about the differences between them and the dynamic interrelationships between these domains. So we have, just to review, the experiential self, that's your perspectival knowing. That private self connects to John Vervaeke's propositional knowing, and the public self is the relationship to what do we propositionally share and what do we hold. And anything that you do, like if you go see a therapist and you sign a contract about confidentiality, well, that's a private and public barrier. Or if you put a lock on your diary, that's another example. You see these squiggly lines here. And this is the other part of the updated tripartite consciousness model I want to share. And that is that there carries 3 different filters between the models. Okay, so the first model is the attentional filter. This is how all the non-conscious knowing processes, subconscious information processing that engage in your brain, coalesces to give rise to your attention and conscious experience. So what gets through the conscious filter, we can talk some about that, but this is how you pay attention to then orient toward what it is that you're going to bring on your screen. So if I say, pay attention to your big toe, you may not have been paying attention to your big toe, but now you can shine the flashlight of experience and then all of a sudden detect that. This is actually a very key thing for meditation. The control of the attentional filter is crucial. Now notice I talked before about the relationship between the experiential self, what do I want, what am I feeling, versus what do I want to feel. The Freudian filter suggests that actually the narrator may want to feel certain things that are quite different than what you actually feel. And this gives rise to a placeholder for Freud's key observation, which namely is that there are reasons behind the reasons that we give, i.e. the ego, private self narrator has actually reasons, and it's sitting on a number of urges, drives, feelings, emotions, etc., that is both filtering out, that's called repression, or allowing through and rationalizing. So what Freud realized was that there's a filtration process between our subconscious needs and desires and our self-conscious rationalizer. And part of the reason as to why is that we can look at great theorists like Freud and then Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers noted that one of the things we have to navigate, and one of the things that's crucial for psychological health, is how judgmental others, recall like my father, and that's silly, creates a particular context that we then need to navigate. That is what creates the pressure to create a social self that's relative to the true self. And if we split our social selves away from our true selves, we get a much more disintegrated and incoherent way of being. Much of what we are trying to do then is try to ally our experiential self into our body through the Freudian filter into a private narrator and through a public self. When you do that, you get what's called vertical and vertical and horizontal integration. And we know from many, many different surveys that when you have relational harmony, positive affect, and coherence across your heart, your head, and your relational world, that is what well-being is fundamentally about, okay? So one of the things then that we're trying to cultivate is trying to cultivate a coherent, effective balance between these domains of self in the relational world, okay? So that's the general model. What we will see in relationship to this is this sets up a model to help us understand how psychedelics might transform this, and this then going to allow us to move into John Vervaeke's work. So here's the ultimate picture. I meant to show this while I was talking about the relational world. This is called the vertical and horizontal alignment that allows between your heart, your emotional, relational self, your narrator, what you publicly say, the filtration dynamics in a relational world that you engage overt actions in a cultural context of justification. And this provides us a map, a general, basic, easy applied map of the various domains of human consciousness. And it's consistent with what we know about neuroscience. It's consistent with what we know about cognitive science and human psychology, as well as social science perspectives, and indeed even social justice perspectives and cultural psychological perspectives. So now we're going to move quickly into John Vervaeke's continuity hypothesis. We recall John's 4 Ps of procedural, perspectival, that's more experiential, propositional, that's more narrator, and participatory, that's more engaged in the environment. So we have now alignment between what I was talking about at the level of consciousness and John's frames for cognition. Now, when we move into what happens in relationship to a psychedelic or higher transformational experience is, as I talked about, there's an ego dissolution. So we talk about really that private narrator that's something about that's going to shift. And there is then an opening of self in relationship to other. And here we have a famous quote from William Blake, a little clip of that captures this: to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. What this captures here is this sort of expansive connection of self in relationship to other. The now becomes eternity. The self becomes extended. The sand becomes the universe. Let's talk a little bit about what might be going on in relationship to this. What John argues is that we should think about higher transformational experiences across a continuity of different events or states and relations. One starts off with just a basic sense of fluency. So this, by the way, is actually very important to help set, if we're doing psychotherapy, to actually set the stage and give people some language for what might be going on. Fluency means an individual has some skill in a particular area, has some narrative about it, and has some capacity to dance with it. So it's not completely novel. If you achieve fluency, you can then grow into a flow. Flow is when you're in an effective participatory state, Okay, you talk about flow in like a basketball game. If you're in the groove and you know where you are and you're not having to worry thinking about everything, that's actually a high level of participative state. You then can transition into a set of insight. So if you find a new pattern, you find a new rhythm, you can then create a higher abstraction. That gives rise to insight. Insight is when you put new things together and see a gestalt. And then finally, a transformation is when you get a new grip on the relation, the overarching relation. So you can see this in the way kids sometimes transition from, say, concrete operations into more formal operations. I get it, I see it, okay? A transformation is when you get a new grip. So what might be happening in general then is a developmental process. When we then move into thinking about higher transformational states, what kind of grip are we maybe getting? The argument from John's vantage point is that we, at our intuitive, perspectival, and participatory ways, which connects to my experiential self, we carry a map, an intuitive map about how we are in the world and how we see ourselves, okay? And we carry a set of core beliefs that are not necessarily propositional, but they're schematic, to use the term from my mentor, Aaron Beck. They're a core schema. Okay, what might be happening through the process of psychedelic use is that individuals go through a series of visions, as it were. Notice they tend to be embodied visions, and the relationship of the self of the world evolves and becomes fundamentally transformed. Okay, and this is actually how many people then talk about it afterwards, like, I see myself differently, or I see the world differently, or I see myself in the relationship to the world differently. And so you have this idea of it transforms the self-world relationship. So what we are offering here is the continuity hypothesis posits that there's a foundational shift in the framing of the agent-arena relationship that is being built upon an emergent transition in one's fundamental sense of being in the world, one's core of participatory knowledge, okay? So why is this important? Well, it provides a plausible frame for what is happening, okay, which is, I believe, absent, or at least not well shared. We want to be able to at least share with ourselves and then begin research that and also have a narrative. It explains some of the values. Why? Well, if it is the case that people were stuck in particular self-world relations, they're released from some of their propositional knowing, they see new patterns and come out of that with a larger extent. We can then potentially cultivate those in a particular way. And then this sets the ways in which the frames may be helpful on the one hand. In other words, if we provide scaffolding, if we do have protections, if we have people around, and they can be potentially problematic. As my dad's anxieties were, this is silly. It is the case. If you play around with this for a while, some people have bad trips. Things can get pretty chaotic. These things don't always lead to a particular way. So you want to have a particular way to kind of put some guardrails on as this exploration happens, okay? So I believe that we can think about much mental health as people getting stuck in places of behavioral shutdown. They get traumatized and they don't know how to metabolize this. They lack in relationship to a sense of meaning in one's relational world. So what these things might do is they may free up they may melt old structures that are blocking these and sticking them, and then allow for an unfreezing and then ultimately a reconsolidation of a new self-world relationship. So the idea is that we can scaffold these, cultivate a particular mindset, engage in psychedelics, and then ultimately provide a framework for dissolving less than helpful parts of the ego, wakening up aspects of the experiential self, providing perfective scaffold, and set the stage for a self-world transformation. So these are some of the guidelines that are actually already being set up, but this framework might provide a way to create those guidance, okay? So placed in relationship, then we can go back, we can also cultivate how relational ritualistic rites of passage and other kinds of excellence tend to structure ourselves and help, again, be guided by the wisdom traditions so that we, in the modern day, can cull from those and utilize those to structure our treatments and offer a transformation. So in conclusion, the updated tripartite model identifies the experiential, public, and private. Vervaeke offers 4 P's of knowing: procedural, perspectival, propositional, participatory. there's a problem called the ontonormativity problem of why are there regular features of transformational experiences in higher consciousness. Continuity hypothesis suggests, and in connection with the updated tripartite model, that we can move from fluency, insight, flow, and then transformation. Suggests that maybe we are essentially dissolving some stuck propositions, opening up the perspectival and participatory view, and this changes the participatory grip that people have in the self-world relation, and this has significant implications for how psychedelics might work. And so thank you very much. The end.
Well, thank you so much, Greg. That is, you know, wonderful new information, I think, for most people in your particular research area, and what your expertise is so profound, and it ties in so well with what, in the optimum way, this psychedelic medicine healing is capable of. Mm-hmm. In terms of shifting people out of their rigid patterns. What I thought I might do is, we're going to open up the chat now so that people can put questions. We also have had some pre-submitted questions, but they're not necessarily in relation to your presentation.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
But I will just ask you one of them, because I think, you know, you've pretty much answered this, but how does MDMA, for example, help complex PTSD?
Right. So let's talk about what happens with MDMA generally. MDMA tends to essentially open up the positive affect system. It opens up the potential for hope and positive relationality. For those of you that don't know, on the street, it's called ecstasy, okay, or a version of it. And so what I believe happens with individuals who have been traumatized, and indeed there's a couple things that are going on in relationship to trauma. I believe, by the way, that MDMA would also open up a positive treatment for depression as well. At least I would certainly make that prediction. But here's what's going on with a PTSD, complicated PTSD. Is an intersection. So there's usually a trauma on top of an individual who already, for complex PTSD, who already has difficulties with coherent integration. Maybe they have a long history of trauma. They have difficulties with coherent integration, which means that they don't know how to internalize and those traumatic experiences at the experiential level. In other words, they don't know how to accept them. They don't know how to relate to them because they're intense and they're brutalizing. They also will develop meaning-making narratives that they are bad, or that the trauma has fundamentally wounded them in a particular way. And they will not know necessarily how to feel in a particular way of comfort, of love, of trust, of hope. Okay, MDMA shifts that. It opens that up. It definitely provides an opportunity. And of course, it's drug induced in a way that is, so that potentially it can be sort of weird and dangerous in that regard if it's done on the street or with lots of people in MDMA. But if we cultivate that, what it can potentially do is open up a whole new way of seeing oneself, which is really filled with love, which is filled with hope, which allows individuals to see particular kinds of meaning. If they can do that and they can relate to themselves with loving compassion, relate to themselves with hope, set the stage for potential situations of forgiveness, because it opens up lots of positive feelings towards the other, those would be situations which would allow for a lot of potential melting of the stuck, bitter, injured, this has horrible meaning implications, and set the stage for a much more different emotional relation to what the trauma might have meant, to who they are, and other people who are entangled in their trauma histories.
Which is why we're seeing, remissions of up to 80% in the trials at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, right. The early data are, I mean, if that can be replicated across a wide, that's revolutionary, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to show just a last couple of slides, and then we're going to come back to you, Greg, with some more questions, because some more are going to come on the chat in a moment. So we're just going to pop these on. Mm-hmm. This is an interesting quote. So actually, many people ask, how did Peter and I set this charity up, or why? And it was actually a blog of Tim Ferriss's that mentioned he was donating to Imperial college for psilocybin trials, and we didn't even know what psilocybin was. And so we started reading some of Michael Pollan's articles, and that's really how we got involved. And I became convinced that we should try this, though we'd never tried any drugs at all in our lives. So, but Tim Ferriss says, I view the next 5 years as an absolutely golden window to invest in this space to help people with mental illness, to affect millions of lives. There just aren't that many opportunities like this. And so Peter and I, as philanthropists and social entrepreneurs, saw this opportunity. Once we tried these medicines under supervision, we realised the potential of them to help the millions of people who are struggling with mental illness, and we started working out ways that we could build an ecosystem to make these medicines available as soon as possible in safe environments, scaffolded by therapy, as Greg has reiterated, which is so important. Next slide, please, Alan. And so lots of people ask us how they can help to make these medicines become available sooner rather than later. So starting conversations, sharing, our webinars. This webinar will go online and you'll be able to watch it and share it. We have volunteering opportunities. There's opportunities to join our state and regional chapters or start a new chapter if there's not one in your area. So contact us if you're interested in that. We have an amazing learn section. Talk to your doctors and medical professionals, because not all of them are as experienced and knowledgeable about these medicines as Greg is, unfortunately, and a lot of them just don't realise the science behind these medicines. So the more we start, I always say doctor by doctor, politician by politician, we need to start sharing the science about these medicines. Fundraising is obviously critical, so we have some wonderful donors, small and large. No donation is too small to make a difference, and we run very leanly. So my husband and I fully donate both our time and our money to make these medicines become available as soon as possible, and we have no interest in making profit from this. Of course, there's many profit opportunities emerging in this space, and that will help scale this industry, but we're interested really in just helping people who need these medicines and alleviating mental illness as much as possible. Follow us on social media. Of course, talk to your local MPs. We have a standard MP letter we can share with you if you want to share that send that to your local MP, attend our summit, and the next slide, please, Alan. So this is a certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapies. We've had quite a few questions on this in the question chat beforehand. And we encourage people to write to us directly with any questions. If you haven't registered for the training yet, suggest you do so ASAP. There's 2 intakes, one starting in January, one in July, but both the intakes will most likely be full over the next few weeks or so. So don't hesitate from applying as soon as possible. And the criteria on the website are very clear, and it explains how you can apply, etc. The next slide. We also have a psychological support services program, which is led by psychologists, both in Victoria and all around Australia. So if you need support, if you are using the medicines and need support to help you integrate these experiences, you can contact us. And next slide, please. And next one, so this is our summit. These are the speakers on the next slide who are meant to be coming to Australia, but we're going to have to work that one out. And we encourage you to register, join us. There's a 2-day introductory workshop for therapists, and that's most likely to go ahead for sure. And the summit, we will, if not doing it in in November, we will certainly be doing it in 2021. So either way, you'll get to participate and meet some of these extraordinary researchers and leaders in this field. Just the next slide, please, Alana. Is that the upcoming events? Yeah, so these are our next webinars. The Psychology of Addictions on August the 12th, August the 26th, Healing Addiction through Psilocybin, MDMA, Ketamine and Ibogaine assisted therapies. And then looking at how we can make MDMA and psilocybin available now through the special access scheme. So now we're going to go back to opening the gallery and seeing Greg there. And Greg, I'm just going to have a quick look at the chat. Oh, there's a great, is that this question?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, Greg, Peter, you want to ask her?
You just get rid of that.
Okay, sure, sorry. Oh, okay.
Yeah, Greg, I was fascinated by that. It's Peter Hunt speaking. I was fascinated by the comment you just made before Tania spoke, when you said that you thought MDMA could be appropriate for working with people with depression.
Mm-hmm.
The whole emphasis to date in trials has been on psilocybin. When you look at the two in relation to depression,
Mm-hmm.
how are they working differently? And why do you think MDMA could actually?
Right.
Yeah.
So right, I'll have to talk from phenomenological viewpoints here. I'm not a well versed in the neuropsychopharmacology and neurochemistry, but so let's just talk about from a phenomenological view what depression is relative to. So for me, according to the unified framework, we should be thinking about depression as a state of mental behavioral shutdown. Okay, that's the proper. So what is depression? Essentially what you have is you have an emotional motivational investment system. That's what that phenomenological energy system is. It's expending work effort. The archetypal opposite of depression is aroused desire. Okay, so the inverse of that is a shutdown. And so what you see is, of course, there's a passive, defeated, hopeless, helpless, excuse my franks, but I share this with people. You feel like shit and you don't feel like doing shit when you're depressed. Okay. It's a state of shutdown. So what MDMA fundamentally is going after is the dopaminergic behavioral activation system. And it's more of a mood alterant at its root. In other words, what it does is it drives happiness and connection, hence the term ecstasy. So ecstasy is essentially the complete inverse of a behavioral shutdown. All right. So that's why when I was back, in my maybe less regulated days, I had that notion a long time ago. I'll say that. Now, so with psilocybin's much more of a perceptual experience. Okay. So what psilocybin does, it plays with more of the perceptual input schema and melts some of those and moves those around. And they certainly have a big impact on your feeling system, but the hit or the transformation, if you talk to people about what they do, it's a much more of a sensory perceptual shift as opposed to a motivational emotional shift. So that's why I always wondered if we were going to move in that direction. To me, MDMA and depression seem like a very important pair. I'm sure some people, but
yeah, it could be very interesting to try them both together for a treatment as well.
Sure, I think that I do think they hit on different elements of perceptual, schematic, phenomenological element, the input element versus the output element of motivation and emotion.
Wow.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Peter's my husband, by the way. So.
Oh. Hey.
and co-founder. Okay, so now I'm going to just race through. We're going to do fast questions, fast answers. So there's so many questions here. So I'll just whiz through some for you. Yes, the recording's going to be available. We'll put it on YouTube. Question for you, Greg. I think you discussed reflecting on the practices of cultures that utilize psychedelics. Are there any particular therapeutic modalities or techniques that seem likely to be most compatible with the therapeutic use of psychedelics, e.g. externalization and narrative therapy, etc.?
I'm more, so my view on psychotherapy tends to be a little bit more on the relational process view. In other words, what I'm looking for in psychotherapy is how effective the individual sets the relational stage. To me, issues of safety and clarity, issues of openness to exploration. These would be the relational process elements. And actually empirically, if you look at what tends to be most associated with outcome, it's these relational process outcome indicators. So does the person feel safe and respected? Does the person feel like they're being explained in relationship to the problem? Does the person understand the task of psychotherapy? These are the process relational outcome indicators, and that I tend to think of those as first and foremost. So when I answer questions about, well, what's going to be efficacious, I'm a principle and process guy rather than sort of, oh, go with this paradigm as opposed to that paradigm.
Okay. And then there's a question here, which is, what about the stuckness of fear of the world, of particular sorts of people?
What about them? No, no. Well, I mean, you know, so let's, for me, we're living in the age of anxiety.
Absolutely. I was going to say.
And so what happens, what I'm seeing happen is, well, first off, there's some good real reason, you know, I'm always like, well, what's the situation? I ask people all the time, well, how depressed do you want to be? And people think that's a weird question. They're like, I don't want to be depressed at all. It's like, well, actually, remember, your emotions and motivations are responding to stuff. If you've lost a lot, if you're shut down, if your whole dream was to play sports and all of a sudden the season's gone, you better believe you're going to be depressed some. So how afraid, how anxious, how fearful, how depressed do we want to be? And the issue there is the first thing that you want to do is you want to calibrate. Negative emotions are not bad. Okay, that's the first. They're not bad to have. They are part of our structure. People get the mistake, and I think that we in the mental health are not good enough to help people realize first and foremost they're there for a reason, and then the issue is, well, how are you relating to them? Okay, so I talk a lot about there's fear, and then there's the fear of fear. All right, so there's a secondary, a negative emotional response to the primary. And then that follows often a lot of rigid cognitive structures about both the self, I wish I wasn't so afraid, and the world, yes, it's a real dangerous world out there simultaneously. And so that's the diagnosis of stuckness. You have somebody who's having a strong negative emotion, they have a negative reaction to the negative reaction emotionally, then they have a cognitive belief in relationship to that, then they engage in safety behaviors to protect themselves in relationship to both the world and the relational spaces that they have. So then how do you manage that from a basic psychotherapeutic perspective? You engage in a developmental process to create the relational space of safety. Then you create awareness about what is going on, acceptance, both about the situation and the world's not going the way you want, and then create a stage of change activation, developmental process, engage in active change so you can learn steps to becoming unstuck. Now, the great hope of the psychedelic experience is that rather than going through the propositional ego narrator that has to have everything all, you know, you set up a ritual and you move the ego narrator out of the way, and then boom, the perspectival system opens up and it's like, oh my gosh, I should have seen this all along. I shouldn't have been told this was so silly. I should have actually maybe explored this in a healthy way. So that's the hope of this.
Well, just on that question, actually, because I have been reading some of your outstanding work in your group lately, and just a question from me is, how do you see what do you see as the positive that's coming from what's happening in the world right now?
Right. Well, I think there is a lot of potential positives. So here's my basic take is, if you know my work, the foundation of my work is a thing called the tree of knowledge. Okay. The tree of knowledge argues that we should think about the world in terms of frequencies of behavior that are mediated by different information communication systems. And real quickly, life is a frequency of behavior that's mediated by cells and genes. Mind is frequencies of animal behavior mediated by the nervous system. Culture, person culture, is the frequency of human behavior mediated by language and justification. Okay. I believe we're actually in the midst of a major transition in the 21st century because we've opened up a whole new information communication system called the digital. All right. And the digital's changing everything. Look at this web. You know, we collapse space-time, we talk to each other, we bring a whole bunch of people together. That changes all of our institutions. It might change them in a positive way, but it also might create a lot of chaos. Okay. So obviously COVID, you know, hurt us and caused us to shut down. It's going to create more anxiety and all this other stuff. But, you know, with crisis comes opportunity. I believe the system was anchored in the 20th century, and we need to get updated and upbooted very quickly to the digital age that's coming. Mm-hmm. My hope is that COVID serves as a enough of a slap upside the head, and I don't mean this to minimize on anyone that's gotten the disease or lost a job, but at a collective level, my hope is that it bumps us and says, yeah, what we were doing was not okay. We fundamentally need to wake up to realize that we have created a global system that's a radically different system than was in the 20th century. The most obvious word, with one word we can say why, digital, that changes everything. And we better be aware of the kind of lifestyles that we are cultivating. And my hope is that COVID sets the stage for us to reflect on where we were, where we are, where we want to go, and what is the fundamental values that we can ground these transitions in. I emphasize dignity, well-being, and integrity as global values. I hope we can revisit what our fundamental global values are, talk about them, transition from some of the capitalistic structures, especially that my country engages in, and is exemplified in some of our political elements that I won't get into, or else we'll be here for 12 hours. But to me, there would be a lot of different ways that we could live wisely, and I hope that COVID wakes us up to those potentials.
Well, that would be a wonderful, wonderful.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, we'll put it out there and hope that we can put these medicines into the water system and wake everyone up.
Right, rock on. There it is.
Okay, I've got a few more. Have you got time for a couple more questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I spent the last 6 months researching the neuroscience DMN of default mode network of psychedelics, mental illness, and combined therapy, psychedelics and meditation, cognitive behavior therapy. What are your thoughts about a combined approach? I think the question is between those different elements.
Yeah, I mean, very positive will be the short answer. Okay, so like for example, mindfulness. I'm a fan of ACT. I grew up for 4 years. I worked with Beck. So that's the traditional cognitive therapy approach, where you identify maladaptive thinking patterns, you become conscious of them, you engage them, and you update them. A mindfulness approach is to observe them, to accept them, and then move toward a committed goal state. I don't see those as an either or choice. Just for give an example, I think that those are, Steve Hayes is a guru and Aaron Beck's a guru. I don't follow gurus, I follow principles, and they both offer really reasonable principles that some people are going to gravitate towards one, some situations will gravitate. To me, as long as we have the right frame of reference, that's what I actually was drawn to the unified frame, all of these good insights that each of the paradigms have. So modern psychodynamic paradigms, modern family systems paradigms, interpersonal paradigms, ACT or mindfulness paradigms, cognitive and behavioral models, they all have really powerful insights. The problem in the field is that they've been captured by the paradigms, meaning they have leaders who emphasize, oh, this is the right way to do it. Then they do research because they need to get tenure professors. And then the research then gets to defining, oh, this is how you have to do it. Of course, actually, no one actually practices that way. Virtually everybody practices based on the principles anyway. The question is, can we integrate the best of the best principles coherently together so we can talk to each other, so we can talk to our patients and deliver comprehensive, coherent, effective models of understanding? That's what I'm after. And it sounds like that person is doing that as far as I can tell.
Fantastic. A question here, is there evidence to indicate how important it is to have therapeutic relationships, e.g. with a clinical psychologist, in the period leading into the psychedelic experience compared to how important the immediate therapeutic setting during the experience is?
So my area of expertise is not psychedelic research. So I don't have the ins and outs of the latest. What you're talking about there is what's called you want to dismantle study a little bit, or at least see, okay, if we measure how much the person liked the therapist and how safe that was, how big of therapeutic impact versus the actual intervention. Therapists have been, and research has been dealing with this problem for a long time in various settings, because everyone's wanting to try to figure out, like, how do you disentangle? I don't know what the latest is. Usually it's kind of hard to disentangle because they sort of have positive feedbacks on each other. In other words, if you like the therapist, you feel safe, then you engage more positively, you have more belief in it, you have more fidelity to it, or you go in more open. And then how you disentangle those belief, relational settings, where the actual intervention is not always easy to do. There usually is a positive dynamic relationship between the two that's not easy to disentangle, but I'm not up on the latest research in terms of psychedelics.
No, that's okay. I'm going to just answer a couple of these. Can you take MDMA while on antidepressants or antipsychotic medication? So just for questions like these, we have a wonderful section on our website. Ilan, what page is it again? If you could put it on the chat screen, so people can see contraindications, how long they need to be off antidepressants before having psilocybin. You can see all of that. We've got some amazing resources there. And actually, Greg, you'll be very interested because we've just done a series of slides on both psilocybin and MDMA with Drug Science UK for universities.
Oh, great.
So we'll send you a copy of those because we'd love you to share them.
Yeah, no, that's an area I need to brush up on. Absolutely.
Ilan, if you could send that through to Greg, that'd be great. There's another question here. Oh, there's a question here. We get a lot of these. Are there any psychedelic therapies currently available to facilitate transformative experiences for healthy people? It is something we're definitely interested in working on, and we're also working on seeing whether the therapists who take part in our certificate can be part of a research trial for healthy patients using MDMA, so that therapists in the training get an experience working with that with other therapists, because we think it's very important for people to have that experience.
I'll throw out there, there's an alternative, but I think very positive media site called Rebel Wisdom.
You've been sharing that.
I try to, there's a founder, David Fuller, and he followed Jordan Peterson, but the co-founder, Ari, I can't remember his last name, but he is super interested in psychedelics across the spectrum. He's trying to cultivate a psychedelic renaissance. And there are, like in Amsterdam, where psychedelics are legal, there are getaways. Obviously, you'd have to be pretty well off, but and we'd have to be post-COVID. But actually, no, there were, you could set up for weekends to go to Amsterdam and explore that. And the way they were describing it in the interview, that I can't remember exactly who it was, but they were talking about the interview, and it was set up for people looking for exactly a safe, well done transformational experience for folks that weren't necessarily struggling with mental health issues.
Yeah, and those Amsterdam retreats, there's some, also on our website, there's also a resource that has all the legal retreat centres around the world as well. Mm-hmm. Another question for you, Greg. What would you say is different and the same about the way you are advocating to approach psychological transformation through the use of plant medicines, and the way hunter-gatherers or cultures with a healthy relationship to ritual psychedelic use approach them?
That's not a super easy question to answer, because I'm not, I don't have sort of an encyclopedic knowledge of all the different, hunter-gatherer approaches, and, there'd be an enormous amount of diversity. So even there, and of course our modern world is, I'll say this, I think that the rites of passage, the ritualistic elements, the close-knit relational value experiences are all things that we, the modern society, needs to learn from hunter-gatherer traditions. We were wedded together in a developmental relational world, in the hunter-gatherer world, that is so very different. And I think that we're starving for that wedded relational community. I think that we don't ritualize our development in the right kind of way. And I think that there's a lot to learn from that, basically.
Absolutely. This is an interesting question. Really appreciate the power of psychedelics to melt unhelpful structures, but could they also break apart useful structures that are needed? How do we make sure that the psychedelic experience melts what's unhelpful and therefore have therapeutic effects as opposed to destabilizing effects?
Great. Well, this is why you want the scaffolding. This is why you want to be careful. I have seen bad trips, both as a clinician and as a friend. Okay, so what happens with a bad trip is an individual melts and then falls into the dark, negative world. And then all of a sudden it gets really scary. You start making associations, and the grip that you have on the self-world relation moves towards hell rather than heaven. And that certainly happens to a subset of people. If you're using them without the right guardrails, without the right professional guidance, with those kinds of things. So there is some risk, undoubtedly. That's why I was not a fan of Nixon's policies, but there are some rational reasons to make drugs illegal. There are dangers associated with them. They do create some potential irrational, impulsive behavior. They give people psychotic visions at times that can be very scary and disorienting. And a number of people have been harmed by them. I think that's the beauty of the therapeutic frame here, is that we can understand what makes it tends to be safe. How do you prepare for it? How do you screen out certain people that may be contraindicated for, and put the safeguards in place, like have somebody there that knows what's going on. So if a bad trip starts to happen, you know how to short circuit it really fast rather than let that thing go off the rails.
Yeah.
And what initially got you interested in these medicines?
Yeah.
Or what makes you more interested in them now, I guess, as well?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I grew up in the Nancy Reagan say no to drugs world. Okay. So at 16, I was under the impression that drugs were the worst thing in the world. And then at 17, I learned that weed was not the worst thing in the world. Okay. And then that was my really first intellectual awakening, was that marijuana doesn't make you go crazy, and it doesn't make you do horrible things, and it's less damaging. And then I researched that, because in college, I became an academic nerd. Not in high school, and then I was like, well, what is this thing, and how do I really understand it? And then I learned about the war on drugs. I learned certainly in our country how unbelievably there's a lot of social justice issues associated with marijuana. African Americans are treated very much more harshly. And I'll share that, there's a garden behind me. I have said publicly in various times, it took a fair amount of grass to grow the garden. Things are now legal here, so that's at least in various domains. But my own experience essentially trails some of what, so I have firsthand phenomenological experience with the phenomenological shift and the different relations between my propositional mind and my perspectival phenomenological mind. So that got me intrigued. Of course, in the United States, and I have not done psychedelics since my early 20s. So it's been a long, long time since I dabbled.
God, you definitely have to do it again. You write another book for that.
It would be, I get enough. I actually have, I'll share, the impact that marijuana has on my psyche creates a creative associative network that actually I cultivate for creative ideas. And then you wake up the next day and you mine the diamonds through the rough. And that's actually a practice that I engage in for my work and idea development. But I'm very cognizant of the potential effective perspectival phenomenological shifts that psychedelics have from a first person perspective.
Fantastic. Well, I think that we are very grateful to you. I know we are. And no, I think we have to, I was going to say, I think we have to finish now, but I would like to, let's see if we can put everyone in the gallery and give Greg a huge clap from everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Go out and order his book, read his work, subscribe to his newsletters. We really appreciate your support for Mind Medicine Australia. It means a lot to us. We have an amazing advisory panel, and you're no exception. So thank you for all the support you're offering us, and keep spreading the word. I think it's just going to be imperative that it's going to be inevitable these medicines will become available soon, and it's just going to be important that we keep them scaffolded with experts like you so that people can have the most beneficial experiences. So that they can heal,
Yeah, no doubt. We can use a little bit of that. Little love, a little healing.
A lot of healing, a lot of global healing. So let's put that out there. And thank you all of you for coming. We would like to invite you all to bring at least 2 people to our next webinar. So we keep on growing the amount of people who attend. And thank you all for your support. It means a lot to us. And we're just continually moved by the comments and the feedback that we're getting from our supporters and followers. And I think together we can really accelerate this, and we can make these medicines available sooner than what we might all think is possible.
Amen. You're doing beautiful work, no doubt.
Thank you. Thanks. Have a lovely day.
Okay.
Take care, everyone. Bye.